Hello, I'm Daniel Lee, and today on Melee Science, we're going to talk about the history of the East Coast versus West Coast crew battles. In the early days of Smash, we didn't really have as many tournaments, and who was the best player was relatively unknown. In fact, it was all up to debate because there was no data and no interaction. The early days of Smash had no online play and very little tournaments to really show who was the best player and who was the best region. There was a lot of trash talk on Smash boards in the early days. And this is because most people were anonymous to one another. So players like Chillin' Dude, the DA members such as Wes and DA Dave would talk about how great the East Coast was, whereas on the West Coast you had guys like Ken, Isaiah, Sultan of Samitude talk a lot on Smash boards that their region was in fact the best. Now, in the early days of Smash, the narrative went like this. The West Coast had the best players, but the East Coast always had the depth, meaning that they had a wide variety of top-level players that greatly exceeded the second tier of players on the West Coast. Eventually, over time, the crew battle format was established within Smash. And the very first crew battle to really demonstrate the skill between the West Coast and East Coast was at FC3. It was a big tournament with a lot of trash talking, and the stakes were high. West Coast really believed they had a great region. The East Coast also believed that their region was going to crush the West Coast in crews. Now, if you guys remember singles, Ken from the West Coast did win singles for the event. However, the East Coast won the very first large crew battle between the coasts. Now, over time, the narrative still continued and persisted. The East Coast players had a strong library of players in their arsenal in the MLG era. For example, you had the top players like Azin, Chu, Korean DJ, Mewtwo King, PC Chris. Whereas on the West Coast, you really had Ken and Isaiah, and then you had a skill drop off with Hugs and King, and then you may have had a few other players that really didn't travel that much, so you didn't really know the full potential of the West Coast. And it wasn't until Genesis 1 that we really had a really awesome showcase of the different coasts again. Now, by this point in time, most of the East Coast legends quit the game, and a lot of the second wave of West Coast players started to get really good. So by 2009, when Genesis happened, this was a good opportunity for the West Coast to ultimately try to steal a crew battle from the East Coast. And although the West Coast had home field advantage in California, and they had a larger percentage of their top players show up, it was the East Coast that once again proved that they were the better coast, with Mewtwo King pulling in his weight, J-Mid and Cactar doing really well, and the West Coast really struggled despite building up a lot of early momentum with Silent Spectre. So unfortunately, the West Coast was disappointed once again. Now in 2011, Genesis 2 happened, and the trend continued to develop. The West Coast was starting to get really strong, and a lot of the East Coast players were still, deciding whether or not they want to commit to Melee, so still a lot of the players were in retirement or they weren't really playing the game as much. So at Genesis 2, the stage was set again in California. However, the East Coast would complain and say that they did not have their top players. So they had players like I Have Spaceballs represent their crew. And to be fair to them, I Have Spaceballs, although he's a fun Samus to watch, he's probably not who you'd want to represent as your top 10 best players on your coast. If you guys remember that crew battle, the story was that Fly Amanita and Wobbles, the West Coast Ice Climbers, put in a ton of work taking a bunch of stocks in that crew battle. Although Hungrybox made a great comeback in the middle of the crew to destroy Lucky, in the end it was Mango as the anchor of the crew battle that ended up settling the score, winning the Falco Ditto against PPMD to take the crew battle for West Coast. And at MLG Anaheim, the narrative flipped. The West Coast was known for its power hitters but lacked depth. Now it was the East Coast players that had the star power of the three gods, but their second and third tier players were not as strong as the West Coast second and third tier players overall. And so it really came down to this. Can Mango, as the one god of the West Coast, carry with his role players against the three gods of the East Coast? If you guys remember the crew battle and how it played out, Mango actually takes 8 stocks collectively off the gods of the East Coast, including Mewtwo King, PPMD, and Hungrybox, and literally just won the crew battle on his own. Because when he's able to take 8 stocks with his 4, that's such a tremendous advantage. And as a result, the West Coast other players were able to carry their weight and go toe-to-toe with the rest of the East Coast crew to win the crew battle. It's been 3 years since the events at MLG Anaheim, and a lot has changed since then. Here at Yahoo, we love to highlight the rivalries between different scenes, and in 2017, we want to solve the question of who is the better coast. So in the beginning of April, we want to do a West Coast versus East Coast event right here at Yahoo. We will be inviting 16 players to face off in an 8 versus 8 crew battle, a 16-man singles bracket, and also we will be running a doubles bracket. It will be fun and amazing to watch to see which coast is the best.